Washington, D.C. These are people who have never been to Israel. They're mostly not Jewish. Army Rangers, Marines, FBI special agents, people who work at the Defense Department, people who work at the Justice Department, White House, Congress, amazing people. And we spent 8 days in Israel, had an incredible time. And I want to tell you about one experience, because it was truly remarkable. We went up to the Golan Heights. I assume everybody knows where the Golan is. Right? It's right on the Syrian border, and we were literally right on the Syrian border. And we trained for an afternoon with Israeli special forces. And these were the guys, they're all guys, seriously big guys, for the ladies, good-looking guys, and really impressive people. And these are the guys that train Israel's most elite combat units, most elite special forces, Sayeret Matkal and others. And they decided to put us through a 4-hour training session. So we're on the Syrian border, and they take us to this bombed-out building that used to be Syrian military headquarters before 1967, right, before the Israelis took it over. And it's right on the Syrian border. And we spent hours doing, Krav Maga martial arts and calisthenics and push-ups and urban warfare combat using attack dogs. And they took us to the top of this building, and they strapped ropes around us, and they made us rappel off. And for those like me who refused to go, they gave me a choice. You either go, or we throw you off the building. So it was the most intense 4 hours I've ever had. And I am not a young guy anymore. I'm really not. And I was with these national security fellows who are all about 20 years younger than me. And by the end of it, the Army Rangers, the Marines, the FBI special agents were all on their back, exhausted. And I was in a fetal position, literally crying out for my mommy. I mean, it was just brutal. And they gave us a taste of what Israelis have got to go through in this combat training. But what was the most profound experience is that we, at the end of it, as the sun was setting, we went up to the top of the building, and we stood there with the group and with these special forces operatives. And they said, all right, take a look out there. What do you see? We said, well, we see Syria. They said, exactly right. And you see that flag over there flapping in the wind? That's the black flag of ISIL, of the Islamic State. So I want to take you through this experience. So here's the experience. So you're standing there, you're looking at Syria, and it's half a mile away, and there is the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Iran's Revolutionary Guards, the Quds Force, and the Assad regime battling it out in a brutal civil war. 200,000 people dead, use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime, right? A complete humanitarian disaster. That's facing Syria at 12 o'clock. That's facing Israel at 12 o'clock. All right, so walk with me. So do one turn to my left, okay, about 11 o'clock, and that's Lebanon, right? Southern Lebanon, Hezbollah land. Right? Hezbollah, the forward guard unit of Iran, an elite combat unit of the Revolutionary Guards. They've got about 120,000 missiles pointing directly at Israel, including advanced missiles with guidance systems that allow them to actually target, as they say, any spot of dirt in the entire state of Israel. Do another turn. Right? That's the Mediterranean. Some good news there, actually. Right? A lot of energy, a lot of natural gas, but actually huge disputes over that natural gas with the Lebanese, with the Palestinians, with the Turks. I mean, it's possible we could see a naval battle taking place in the Med over energy. But so far, it's quiet. Well, let's keep turning. So keep turning, 6 o'clock. We get to Gaza. Right? I was in Israel this summer with my 6-year-old son. We were in the middle of a war, rockets falling, running to bomb shelters, sleeping in safe rooms. Just a taste of what Israelis have got to experience. And Hamas is reconstituting its arsenal, right? Thanks to Iran. Getting more missiles, missile technology, more advanced missiles, rebuilding its terror tunnels. Keep turning. The Sinai. How many of you have been to the Sinai? Right, do you remember the Sinai? It was a great place to scuba dive. Okay, the Sinai was beautiful. Today the Sinai is lawless. And there's a group there which is affiliated with the Islamic State, currently decapitating Egyptian soldiers and Egyptian police officers. It's a no-go zone. We will never go to Sinai again. Egyptians don't go to Sinai again, and certainly Israelis, for them, this is no man's land. So let's keep turning. All right, where do we go? We go to the West Bank. West Bank today, we were in Ramallah 3 weeks ago. We met with the head of the Palestinian Preventive Security Services. Brings us into his office. It was a scene right out of The Godfather. Okay? Brings us in. We sit on these cushy couches under the busts of Arafat. And there is this really mean-looking guy speaking in Arabic with a translator, telling us about his job as head of the Palestinian Preventive Security Service. And he sounds like a tough guy, and he's really doing amazing things. You know, he doesn't like the Israelis. The Israelis are terrible, but he's got control. Now, actually, it was kind of funny because right behind him, there was a TV screen showing Tom and Jerry cartoons. So it's like, this is way too surreal. But the reality is, as we later learned in our discussions with the Israeli Shin Bet, is if the Israeli security services pulled out of Ramallah, what do you think would happen? Hamas would take over. Okay, so that's the West Bank. Palestinian Authority, Abbas, terrible corruption, problems with incitement, and literally one turn of the screw away from Hamas. Let's go over the border. Okay, now we're in Jordan. Okay, the Hashemites, generally good people, pro-American, have a good relationship with Israel. What happens if the US and Israel were not supporting the Hashemites? What would happen to Jordan?
Palestinian state.
Well, Palestinian state, but ISIS, Muslim Brotherhood, right? Jordan, majority Palestinian, would fall to the radicals. All right, so that was a sort of 360 sweep of Israel's borders. That's what Israel faces daily in terms of its threat environment. Now let's go over Jordan and let's finally get to Iran. Because as I've gone 360, there's been a common theme. Iran supporting Assad, Revolutionary Guards, Quds Force, Hezbollah, Iran resupplying Hamas, okay? Iran fanning the flames of sectarian warfare in the Middle East, the arsonist that gave rise to ISIS, now presenting itself as the great firefighter that's going to help the United States combat ISIS. But there's a common theme and a common thread, and that is the threat from Tehran. And now when we look at Iran, we look at an Iranian regime, leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world, according to the Obama State Department, brutally repressing its own people. Under the so-called moderate President Rouhani, executions have soared. Iranians are executing at least one person a day, if not more. Massive human rights abuses. Continuing to sponsor terrorism around the world. Who's ever heard of Qasem Soleimani? Who's Qasem Soleimani?
He's the head honcho of the Quds Force.
Exactly. Now, what's amazing to me, because I ask this question to audiences all around the country, including in Washington, D.C., and if I asked you guys, all right, who is bin Laden? Hands up? He's dead, but who was bin Laden? Okay. Who's Nasrallah? Hezbollah, right? Qasem Soleimani is the world's most dangerous terrorist that only one man has heard of. And in Washington, D.C., you get the same reaction. Qasem Soleimani is a man who existed in the shadows. He's the commander of the Quds Force. This is the overseas terrorist unit of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who are the Praetorian Guards of the Iranian regime. So Soleimani is the guy. He's the major domo of the Middle East. He is the one, okay, who works with Hezbollah, supplies Hamas, is working in Syria protecting the Assad regime. He's on the ground. He's in Iraq. He's working with Shia militias. He's taken over Yemen. He's got his hands in everything. And Qasem Soleimani is so confident now of his role that he's taking selfies all over the Middle East. We're finally seeing photos of Qasem Soleimani. The man in the shadow is now taking selfies because he's confident. He's winning. We haven't even got to Iran's nuclear program yet. That was just the good news. The bad news is Iran's nuclear program. All right, so where are we with the nuclear program? Well, the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, has been dedicated to a nuclear weapon for decades. Right? Khamenei understands that a nuclear weapon is what guarantees the survival of his regime. He's an old man. He may not have too many years on this earth left, inshallah. But he wants to leave Iran with, at very least, the capability to develop a nuclear weapon. And Ali Khamenei is very open about his red lines. He repeats them every week. He says, these are my red lines. I will not compromise. Okay. To Ali Khamenei's credit, he hasn't compromised. So we've been engaged in negotiations with the Iranians, we the West, for how many years? Yeah, we've been engaged for about 15 years. And negotiations really began in an intensive way in about 2003 with the Europeans. And they've continued with the Europeans, and then we got engaged, and we got engaged in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration, and we've been talking to the Iranians for years. And what's happened to the Iranian nuclear program? Just keeps moving forward, keeps moving forward. But the interesting thing is that the current president of Iran, Rouhani, had another job 10 years ago. Does anybody know what it was? He was a nuclear negotiator, exactly. And when he was a nuclear negotiator, he actually brags about how he pulled the wool over our eyes. In his autobiography, in the election campaign, he brags about the fact that his entire strategy in dealing with the Europeans at the time was that he was going to suspend the elements of the nuclear program that Iran had already perfected in order to buy time for those elements of the program that Iran hadn't perfected. And at the time, there was this guy, I think his name was the Mad Bomber Bush. That's what the Iranians call him, the Mad Bomber Bush. Because Rouhani went to Khamenei and said, Mr. Supreme Leader, we got a problem. These Americans just took down Saddam Hussein like that. The guy that we fought an 8-year war over, 1 million lives. U.S. military just took Saddam down and his entire military in a matter of weeks. So we got a problem. So I would like your authorization to negotiate. And sure enough, Rouhani negotiated with the Europeans. And while he was negotiating, they suspended their enrichment, bought their time, and continued to develop other pathways to a nuclear weapon. And this sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because now Rouhani is the president. His former deputy is now the nuclear negotiator, Zarif. And everybody has now walked into what I call the Rouhani-Zarif distortion field. It's a very powerful distortion field. When you walk into it, you are left with the impression that these are moderates and pragmatists. And these are men who want to do a deal. And they want to bring Iran in from the cold. But what is Rouhani and Zarif doing again? What they're doing is suspending those elements of the nuclear program that they have perfected in order to buy time for the elements of the program they haven't perfected. So what have they done? They suspended 20% enrichment. They know how to do it. They know how to restart it like that. They took their 20% stockpiles and they converted it into nuclear fuel. No problem, they'll make more. What have they gotten? Well, they've gotten the following concessions from the United States up front. And I can tell there's a lot of successful business people around here, so you will understand why this is not a good negotiating strategy. Okay. So they came in and they said, we refuse to give up on enrichment. And we said, okay. And then they said, we refuse to discuss our ballistic missile program, including our intercontinental ballistic missile program. You know, the one that you need to hit the United States with? We would refuse to talk about it. And we said, okay. And they said, we refuse to dismantle anything. And I looked up the definition of dismantle. It means to separate and render inoperable. And that used to be the US negotiating position. And we said, wow, this is challenging because the president has promised and Secretary Kerry has promised and everybody has promised to dismantle Iran's nuclear program. We got to find a solution around dismantle. So let's start talking about disconnecting centrifuges and technical modifications to the heavy water reactor and technical modifications to the Fordo facility that's buried under a mountain in a Revolutionary Guard base. We're going to try to find a way not to dismantle anything. And we said, okay. And then we said, they said, you know what? We don't like our basic centrifuge. It sort of breaks down a lot. I know we got 18,000 of them, but we don't like them. They break down. We want to do advanced centrifuge R&D. And why do we want to do that? Because we want a more efficient model that can produce the same amount of uranium, but more quickly. Now we know that what they really want is they want fewer centrifuges, because it's a lot easier to hide 1,000 centrifuges than it is to hide 19,000 centrifuges. Gives them a clandestine breakout option. So what did we say? Okay. We gave up 4 massive concessions that represented a severe deterioration of the U.S. negotiating position and a radical departure from years of U.S. demands and UN Security Council demands that Iran suspend its enrichment, suspend its plutonium reprocessing, stop its long-range ballistic missile program, and reassure the international community about its past and possible continuing weaponization activities. And the Iranians said, thank you for the concessions. In return, we would like more flexibility, as they pocketed the concessions. And now we're negotiating with them. And they've taken the biggest concessions off the table, they pocketed them, and now they're asking for more flexibility. And this is why when you folks read the newspaper and you watch television and you hear about these nuclear negotiations, which seem to be arguments about number of centrifuges and all these technical questions, and you've got to be a nuclear physicist to understand exactly what's going on. You know, how many Iranian swoos dance on the head of a centrifuge. And nobody understands this stuff. This is what's going on. This is what was happening in Vienna, and before that in Geneva, and that's what's going to happen for the next 7 months. The United States, along with its P5+1 partners, is going to try to find some technical compromise, some technical Rubik's Cube, as Undersecretary Wendy Sherman, the chief nuclear negotiator, calls it, to accommodate Ali Khamenei's red lines. Meanwhile, that's just physics. Let's talk about economics. We actually had the Iranians on their back last year economically. They were, by our assessment, 4 to 6 months away from economic collapse. They were facing a massive balance of payments crisis. We had locked up their oil revenue. We had slashed their oil exports. Inflation was up at 40%. The exchange rate had crumbled by 75%. They were running out of money. They were facing hyperinflation. They were facing stagflation. The Iranian economy was on its back. We had serious economic leverage. And that actually sent a message to Khamenei. You know what? Stop nuclear escalation. Start nuclear negotiation. And he said to Rouhani, what you did to the Europeans in 2003, 2005, do it again. Go in again. And Rouhani went in, and he got sanctions relief, billions of dollars of direct relief. President Obama blocked new sanctions legislation from Senators Menendez and Kirk. He de-escalated the pressure. Lo and behold, 12 months later, Iranian economy no longer on its back, now on its knees, slowly getting up to its feet. Economy's recovered, positive growth, inflation cut from 40% to 14%, Riel has stabilized, Iran is getting its oil revenues back month by month, $700 million every month we pay them, stay at the table. We've suspended auto sector sanctions, oil export sanctions, petrochemical sanctions. What's happened to our economic leverage? It's diminishing. Our nuclear negotiating leverage on nuclear physics is diminishing as we give up concessions. Our economic leverage is diminishing as we give up concessions. And then the Iranians play the most brilliant card of all. Because they're beating us in nuclear physics and they're beating us in economics, there's one more card to play. And that's called the Islamic State. I don't know if you read today, but the United States and Iran are not partnering in Iraq or in Syria in military strikes against the Islamic State. Secretary Kerry assures us we're not partnering with the Iranians. So how many of you think we're partnering with the Iranians? Show of hands. before we even discuss whether it's a huge mistake, the majority of you think that the US administration is not telling you the truth. They are denying any cooperation. They are denying that we're even deconflicting, which is a military term for, hey, my plane's going that way, your plane's going that way, let's not crash. They say that's not happening. Well, ladies and gentlemen, your instincts are right. Of course it's happening. It's happening because Qasem Soleimani, the world's most dangerous terrorist one man had heard of, is orchestrating this whole campaign. The Islamic State is the Islamic State because of Iran. Why is that? Very simply put, Iraq, a Shia government led by a guy named Maliki, backed by Iran, brutalizing Iraqi Sunnis. The same Sunni tribes that actually worked with us to stabilize Iraq during the surge are now getting brutalized and marginalized by the Maliki government, which is a Shia sectarian government backed by Iran, orchestrated in the background by Qasem Soleimani. The response of Iraqi Sunnis, they're increasingly radicalized. They have nobody to turn to. Who do they turn to? The Islamic State. Go to Syria. Assad regime, a Shia government, Alawite, a sect of Shiism, backed by Iran, dropping chemical weapons and barrel bombs on the Syrian Sunnis, right, who peacefully launched an uprising against Assad's oppression and now getting viciously brutalized. Their response, increasingly radicalized. Who do they turn to? The Islamic State. And who is fanning the flames of the sectarian warfare? Qasem Soleimani, Ali Khamenei, and the Iranian regime. And as I said before, lo and behold, right, the arsonist fanning the flames is now presenting themselves as the essential firefighter. You need us to take care of the Islamic State, the United States of America. And then I'll just end with this. Okay. Just in case you think this may be conspiratorial fiction, we discovered in the Wall Street Journal only 2 weeks ago that President Obama has written his 4th letter to the Supreme Leader. 4th letter. And this letter, according to the Wall Street Journal, basically says, Dear Supreme Leader, please compromise on the nuclear program, because if you do, we can work together on defeating the Islamic State. Wow. It's in a letter written by the President of the United States to the Supreme Leader of Iran. Now, forget about the wisdom of that letter. Forget about whether Ali Khamenei looks at that letter and says, wow, what a wonderful gesture of confidence building. Or he looks at the letter and says, that's exactly what I always told you. America's a paper tiger. America is weak. America needs us more than we need them. And what does that do? It only increases his contentment and his contempt for the United States of America, which means we no longer have a credible threat of military force. We no longer have real economic warfare leverage. We are now literally imploring the Iranians to work with us on the Islamic State while trying to negotiate an agreement with Iran and claiming that none of that is going to affect our negotiating position. Now, people always say to me, and with this I really will conclude, people always say to me, so what? So Iran becomes a threshold nuclear power. So we negotiate an agreement. It's not a perfect agreement, but it's an okay agreement. It cuts off certain pathways. There's some technical modifications. It extends the breakout time. The Iranians have a more difficult time getting a nuclear weapon than before. What's wrong with that? Because the alternative to that, says the administration, is we're going to have to go to war. You ratchet up the sanctions pressure. The Iranians ratchet up the nuclear physics. We'll be playing chicken. Escalation, war. Okay. You know, the problem with that is, well, they lie. Our enemies always lie. You never trust, you verify, says Ronald Reagan. Problem is verify? Verify what? Because the Iranians are saying, we will never, ever let you into a Revolutionary Guard base. We'll never let you under any mountains on a military base. You will not go anywhere, go in time inspections. You will be able to see our managed sites, and we'll let you see certain other sites, but you can't go anywhere. Well, that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? I mean, if you can't go anywhere, how do you actually verify whether the Iranians are actually complying with their agreement or whether they're building clandestine nuclear facilities the way they've done in the past. Mike Hayden, who's the former director of Central Intelligence, the former director of the NSA, said to me, and then testified beside me last week to Congress, and members of Congress almost fell out of their seats. Because when I tell something to members of Congress, whatever, Mark Dubowitz, some guy from Canada. Mike Hayden, 4-star general, DCI, NSA director, Mike Hayden says, members of Congress, if I were the Central Intelligence Director today, I could not, and the intelligence community could not, verify an Iranian nuclear agreement. What's Mike Hayden saying? Mike Hayden is saying, we don't know what's going on in Iran. We don't actually have the ability to actually have eyes into this program. If we go anywhere, go anytime inspections, we can get inspectors, we can crawl around the region, we can go into Revolutionary Guard bases, we might have a chance. But without that, Mike Hayden, if I were DCI, I could not verify an Iranian nuclear agreement. How does the region respond to that? Well, the region responds to a bad nuclear deal in some profoundly disturbing ways. The Saudis call the Pakistanis and say, remember how we financed your bomb? Send a bomb FedEx. We're going to build our own nuclear program. The Turks, the Egyptians, the Algerians, there's no way they're going to let the Shias have a bomb. The Sunni powers in the Emirates, there's no way they're going to let a Shia country have the bomb. So now you're going to have 6 or 7 countries, right, all on a nuclear hair trigger, whether by accident or by design. There's a nuclear catastrophe. Now, God bless, I know these negotiators are trying hard, and I know President Obama is trying hard, but try to lead that one from behind. That's what we're facing. That's what we're facing. And I'll say to you, which is why I love coming to Virginia Beach, why I love going to talk to Americans, and why I love getting out of Washington. Because as soon as you get to the 495 in Washington, somebody comes in at the toll booth, takes your common sense, and strips it away. And fills up your head with lots of figures and facts and brilliant strategic concepts, but you lose your common sense. And then you go out and you talk to those bright students today at that high school and those wonderful African American students at that community college, and they haven't lost their common sense. You talk to the Navy guys sitting there, and they haven't lost their common sense. Because they know Iran is an enemy of the United States. They know Iran is responsible for 50% of US combat deaths in Iraq. They know Iran has been killing our men and women for decades. So this isn't just Israel's problem, this is America's problem. And I hope and pray we can get past the partisan bickering and the bickering between Jerusalem and Washington and figure out a way to solve this problem, because for our children and our grandchildren, they're going to face a Middle East with 6 countries on a nuclear hair trigger. And that will be an absolute disaster. And on that happy note, I'd like to ask if you have any questions or comments. And particularly if you disagree with me.
And just make sure that everything is in a question. My question is, we don't want to get to statements of opinions, so let's make sure we've got a great resource here. Let's ask a pointed question.
If you want to praise my speech, you are welcome to have comments. Okay, so let me talk about 2 elements of that question, the means and the intention. So let me take the simple one, means. So those who know aren't saying, and those who say don't know. That was easy. Okay. Seriously, I have no idea. I mean, I would say this, which is what Ehud Barak said once. If we bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, and you wake up the next morning and you are not surprised by how we did it, then we have failed. Okay, so
That's easy.
means. Intentions, I don't have to tell you. It sounds like you're Israeli. Okay, I don't have to tell you about intentions. I mean, I do not think Benjamin Netanyahu is bluffing when he says we cannot live with a nuclear-armed Iran. I mean, let's put aside all of the catastrophic scenarios for a second. The Iranians are going to rain down nukes on Tel Aviv. The Iranians are going to hand off nukes to Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations. By the way, no Israeli prime minister can dismiss those possibilities, even if there's only a 5% chance. Right? Those are catastrophic. That's the end of Israel. So you cannot dismiss those possibilities the way a lot of my colleagues in Washington just sort of poo-poo them. Like, yeah, this is a rational power. They're not going to bomb Tel Aviv because they know they'll get bombed. Or they're not going to give it to Hezbollah because Iran has no record of giving WMDs to terrorist organizations. Well, you know what? There was a first time. And by the way, last I looked, an Iranian ally, Bashar Assad, was dropping chemical weapons on his people. So let's put that aside. I think the Israelis, and I think that the Prime Minister, and I do think at the end of the day, the Israeli security establishment, which right now is very divided over this question, I believe that they will ultimately do what Meir Dagan has said publicly, and the new Israeli Chief of Staff actually has said recently, which is we shouldn't bomb Iran until the dagger is at our throat and it's cutting into our flesh. It's not a great visual, but I think it's very, very powerful. I think that when they get to that point where they realize they no longer have any other options, they will do it. I don't know how they'll do it. I don't know when they'll do it. But I know in my heart there's no way they can live with a nuclear-armed Iran. They just can't do it. And will there be a rupture in U.S.-Israel relations? Possibly. Depends on who's president, but possibly. But I will remind everybody in the audience, in 1967, Lyndon Johnson said, you go first, you go alone. Right? I'll remind you that in 1981, the Reagan administration, right, read the Riot Act of Menachem Begin. You bomb the Iraqi Osirak reactor, you will not have America's support. I remember as a kid, I think it was around my bar mitzvah, right? I remember George H.W. Bush going on national television and saying, this has been a violation of Iraq's territorial integrity. Right? I think 10 years later, everybody said, whew, thank God for Begin. 2007, I know for a fact, the Israelis came to Washington. They came to George W. Bush and his national security team, and they said, here is all of the evidence that we've gathered, exhaustive evidence. We had special forces operators in Syria collecting soil samples. Here's all the evidence. This Syrian reactor is about to go hot. And George W. Bush, right, mired in Iraq, facing all of these national security challenges, said to Ehud Olmert, let's try diplomacy. And Olmert said, Mr. President, thank you very much, turned around, and I don't know, it was a week later or 2 weeks later, they bombed the Al-Khaybar reactor in Syria. So listen, Israel's got a track record, number one, of going it alone when it feels threatened. Number two, of ignoring American orange and red lights. And number three, pulling off some rather remarkable and creative operations. Past is not prologue, but it's certainly an indicator.
Within the last day or two, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed an Arab-sponsored motion to declare the Middle East nuclear-free and force the Israelis to acknowledge and dismantle their nuclear program. Could you make a comment or two on that?
Look, it's brilliant. I mean, you got to give credit to the Arabs and the Iranians. It's brilliant. I spent a lot of time in Europe with European diplomats talking about nuclear issues. And I got to tell you, at every single meeting, when we're talking about Iran's nuclear program, the question of Israel's nuclear program comes up. European diplomats will insist to you, look, the solution to this is a nuclear-free Middle East. Israel is a rogue nuclear power. They're not in compliance with their obligations on the Non-proliferation Treaty. If Israel moved first, dismantled and, let's say declared, and then moved to dismantle its nuclear program, it would remove a provocation. A provocation. That is the political reality today, not in the Arab world, not in Iran, that's in Europe. And that is something that is increasingly being accepted internationally. I mean, the obvious counter to that, I remember being on BBC, Mr. Dubowitz. It seems to me fairly obvious here that they are a rogue regime. I said, I agree with you. Iran is a rogue regime. I was not talking about Iran, Mr. Dubowitz. I was talking about Israel and its illegal nuclear program. Well, one point of contention would be that last time I heard, I haven't seen an Israeli prime minister threatening to wipe Iran off the face of the earth. That might be a small distinction, maybe lost in translation between American and British. But, yeah. What are the other options besides bombing Iran's nuclear facilities? Should we tighten the sanctions? What else can we do? So, all right. Well, I'm president, so let's assume. All right. Look, what would I do in these negotiations? Here's a few things that I would do. The first thing I'd say to the Iranians is, really? You want to walk away from the table? Go. Goodbye. Because you keep threatening and blackmailing us that you're going to walk away. Goodbye. And I'd stop threatening Congress and calling them warmongers. I'd go to the Iranians and I'd call their bluff and say, go. And by the way, on your way out of the door, okay, before you get home, I'm going to drop a tidal wave of sanctions on you so profound that I am going to collapse your economy. So before that happens, if you want to come back to the table, give me a call. Here's my number. But goodbye. That's the first thing I do. Because we cannot win a negotiation if we are not willing to walk away. We cannot win a negotiation if the President of the United States keeps threatening Congress and saying to Congress that if you ratchet up the pressure, the Iranians are going to walk away. So he's playing into the Iranian trap. I mean, he who is willing to walk away from a negotiation, by definition, will win a negotiation. Well, we all know that. We bought used cars, we bought homes, we've negotiated with 6-year-olds. Second alternative, send your 6-year-old to negotiate with the Iranians. How many of you have got 6-year-olds or dealt with 6-year-olds? All right, how do 6-year-olds negotiate? Well, my 6-year-old, here's how he negotiates. Abba, I want 100 Pokemon cards. No, I bought you so many Pokemon cards, you're not getting any more. I want 200 Pokemon cards, 300 Pokemon cards in a DS machine, and I want, wow, escalating demands. I thought we were going to diminish the demands. No, we're going to escalate the demands. Second way they negotiate. Tantrums. You don't give me what I want, I am going to scream and cry, and I'm going to drive you crazy, and I'm going to wear down your nerves, and this will be sheer attrition, and I am much, much more strong-willed than you are, Abba. I will wear you down. Right? Sound familiar? Okay. Third way I would negotiate, that 6-year-olds negotiate. And that is 6-year-olds will use seduction, charm and persuasion. You know, Abba, you are the world's best Abba. There's no Abba like you. You are the greatest Abba. You are the most wonderful Abba. And an Abba that's so wonderful like you could never refuse a 6-year-old like me because I am so cute. Threats, seduction, bluster, escalating demands. Welcome to the Iranian negotiations. It's called the Zarif Rouhani distortion field. Right? And so what I would do is I'd call their bluff. I'd stop playing their games. I'd start giving them concessions up front. I'd actually hold back concessions. I would stop this nonsense of, oh, I see, that you can't do because that is a matter of national pride. And I don't want to humiliate you because you have dignity. Persian dignity is a powerful thing. So you're right. Okay, we'll agree to that concession because I don't want to insult you. Really? What about American pride? What about American dignity? What about America saying no? Because the reality of Persian dignity is this isn't about the Iranians, this is about the regime. Because if you actually did an accurate poll in Iran today, an accurate poll, let me talk about how they poll in Iran, and you asked Iranians, so given the choice, would you like to have a nuclear weapon or would you like to have a robust economy? I don't know, let's find out what Iranians actually think. Let's put them to a stark choice, because like my 6-year-old, and like all of us, if they can have everything, then they want everything. But you put them to a fundamental choice between a bomb or a job, between a ballistic missile or a paycheck, they may have a very different opinion. Now, all of the geniuses in Washington will tell you, oh, Mark, we have done polling. And here's what the polls say. They say this is a matter of Iranian national pride, and the Iranians support a nuclear program. And it's a weapon or civilian, that distinction is lost. But anyway, they support a nuclear program. Okay. And as a result, the supreme leader can't back down, because then he would face the wrath of the Iranian voter. You know the Iranian voter? That wonderful free-form voter that gets to decide exactly who they want to vote for from a list of a hardline candidate, a really hardline candidate, an insane hardline candidate, and a total whack job. That's an Iranian election, and that's the Iranian voter. But I always ask my friends in Washington who are so poll-driven, I see how this works. So a polling company calls an Iranian family on a Friday night, celebrating Shabbos. Maybe not, just having a Friday night dinner. The phone rings, and the father answers the phone, and he says, hello, it's Ahmed Samajad here. And they say, oh, Ahmed, hi, I'm calling from an Iranian polling company in Tehran. We'd like to ask you a series of questions. Sure, go ahead. Question number 1. Do you support an Iranian nuclear program? Yes. Do you support an Iranian nuclear weapons program? Yes, yes. Do you support an Iranian nuclear program with weapons and ballistic missiles? And yes, yes, yes. And should we surrender to those Americans? No, no, no. Ahmed, thank you for your answers. That was wonderful. I'm sure that our polling company and the president will be very happy. Put down the phone. I mean, who in their right mind is going to give an honest answer to a poll in an authoritarian, brutal state where if you defy the regime, you end up in Evin prison, either subject to torture, rape, or execution? So anytime you hear some Washington policy wonk tell you that the Iranian people think X and we got polling that justifies that, please remind them of the Friday night story. So bottom line is, put the Iranian regime to a choice between its own survival or a nuclear weapon. But unless we start getting tough about this, they're going to get both. They're going to survive and get a weapon and have a robust economy, and Qasem Soleimani will be taking selfies all over the world.
Your report to us tonight is terrifying, and your solution is so basically simple, it's wonderful. Our president and our Secretary of State obviously don't agree.
Totally.
So question, are they stupid?
Nope.
Are they mean? Are
Nope.
they, what?
No, no. So I spent a lot of time talking to the White House and to the State Department about this, and talking to the nuclear negotiators. And they are incredibly smart people, and they are incredibly dedicated public servants, and they are very kind people, and I have a lot of respect for them. And we spend hours and hours and hours talking about this issue. And they're kind enough to invite me, who am I, some kid from Canada, who's decided to come to Washington. They invite me to the White House all the time to talk about these issues because they're looking for new ideas. So I've had the benefit of actually listening to their arguments over months and months and months. And they make a rational argument. And here's their argument. Mark, we agreed with you before Rouhani was elected. Ahmadinejad was a lunatic. Okay? The Revolutionary Guards were in charge. They were escalating the nuclear program. We had to hammer them with sanctions. And we did. And we got them to the table. They never really give much credit to Congress for getting the sanctions imposed, but nonetheless, sanctions got them to the table. And then Rouhani was elected, and we have an opportunity. And here is the opportunity. Rouhani may be Gorbachev. He may not be, but let's test him. He may be Gorbachev. He may be a man of the system, a man of the regime, a man of the revolution, who had that epiphany that this wasn't working. And we have got to give him the opportunity, and his deputies Arif the opportunity, to try and reach a nuclear deal. We have said repeatedly, no deal is better than a bad deal. No deal is better than a bad deal. I actually had a meeting in the White House when it started with, thank you for coming, no deal is better than a bad deal. It ended with, thank you for coming, a bad deal is better than no deal. That's called a gaffe in Washington. when an administration official tells the truth. He literally flipped it. But it shows the mentality. The mentality is, you know what, a bad deal is better than no deal. A no deal means war. We're not going to war in the Middle East. So we'll take a bad deal. And by the way, let's give Rouhani a chance. He may be the next Gorbachev. He's the pragmatist. He is the moderate. And he's certainly better than those Revolutionary Guard nutcases. And let's empower him and undercut the hardliners. In case you're following the action, let me just give you the lay of the land. The hardliners are in Iran, the Revolutionary Guards, and the Supreme Leader. The hardliners in America are senators and representatives of the US Congress. Those are the hardliners. Democrats and Republicans. Those are the hardliners, according to the narrative. Right? And the pragmatists, the moderates, are Rouhani and Zarif, and those in the administration, including the president, who are looking for nuclear compromise. That's how the political divide is laid out. So that's their narrative. Look, maybe they're right. I mean, maybe they're right. God willing, they're right. And they can strike a great nuclear deal with the pragmatist and the moderate who's got the authority to do a deal. He'll sell that deal to Khamenei. They'll undercut the Revolutionary Guards. Money will flow back into Iran. Iranian economy will be lifted. They'll increase the power of the middle class. They'll undercut the religious crazies. Iran will emerge as a rational, wealthy, moderate influence in the Middle East. And they'll never build a nuclear weapon. They'll just use this to generate electricity. Maybe they're right. Yeah, the first question is, U.S. has superior military power. Why is the U.S. not using it? And the second is, what's going to change in January when the next Congress sits with respect to the Iran negotiations? So to the first question, look, President Obama has been pretty honest to all of us since he was a senator. And then he became president. Okay? He has said, I'm here to wind down wars in the Middle East. He has said the tide of war is receding. He said Al-Qaeda is on the run, and I've obliterated them. Okay? He said, I'm going to engage with America's enemies. I'm going to talk to them. You got to talk to your enemies. Talking to your friends is easy. You got to talk to your enemies. President Obama has said repeatedly, all options are on the table, and then said, but using military force could be a disaster. And when he drew a red line with Bashar Assad and he said, you crossed my red line, and Bashar Assad said, there you go. And he said to Putin, no more. You got Crimea, but no more. And Putin said, I'm just waltzing into eastern Ukraine. And he doesn't respond. It tells you a lot about President Obama. It tells you President Obama does not want to use military force if he doesn't have to. And he doesn't believe he has to. He believes he can solve the Russia-Ukrainian crisis, the crisis over Syria, the crisis with Iran, diplomatically, using other tools of coercive statecraft. Now, I would argue as a critic, President Obama, I don't want to go to war. I have not been a supporter of war against Iran. I have not been a supporter of military strikes. I've been a supporter of sanctions and coercive diplomacy. But the problem right now is that you've taken military force off the table because Khamenei doesn't believe you're going to use it. You're taking economic leverage off the table because you're de-escalating the sanctions pressure and telling the world that members of Congress who back new sanctions are warmongers. You're no longer engaged in serious covert action. What do you got left? You know what you got left? You got talking. And you got offering concessions. And you know what the Supreme Leader is saying to your concessions? No, no, no. Because the Supreme Leader is a rational man. He knows that to agree to concessions today is to give up on future concessions in the future. So why would he give up? He's a smart negotiator. I'm just going to hang in here. Because all I know is, based on your track record, there are more concessions to come. So, second question, what can Congress do about it? Well, I can tell you Congress is working really hard right now, today, on new legislation. Both Republicans and Democrats. And it's a whole new ballgame in January. Harry Reid is no longer there. So he can't bottle up any legislation. So I would expect you would see legislation moving. You may see various pieces of legislation moving. You may see a bipartisan vehicle, a kind of Kirk Menendez. You may see a Republican vehicle, Corker Graham. You may see other Republican vehicles with other senators on. And there'll be a whole bunch of different proposals. And then I think you will see the administration taking a page from the November playbook, launching a massive political campaign against Congress, and once again doing something which they successfully did last November, which is they blocked legislation by accusing members of Congress who supported it of being warmongers. And not just Republicans. I mean, gee, that was easy. You know, the other party, warmongers. They went after Democrats. They went after Bob Menendez. You know, Bob Menendez of New Jersey. A man who knows all about authoritarian leaders, a Cuban American, and a man of serious iron will. They went after Bob Menendez. They called him a warmonger and worse. So I don't know. I don't know whether Democrats are going to stand their ground. I don't know how many are going to support Republicans. I do know that if you want to know where things are going, pay really, really careful attention to one person. Who is that? Who's that? Okay. Don't pay attention. Pay attention to one. I'll give you a hint. He's a she. Hillary. Pay attention to Hillary. Because where Hillary goes, Democrats go. And if she provides even a small opening for them, political cover, they will go under her political wing. And if she goes in that direction, Democrats will go. If she doesn't go in that direction, it's going to be tough. But I think for Hillary's got the biggest problem of all. And here's the problem. The problem is, it's a nuclear deal. It gets signed, let's say, in July. That leaves another 18 months for the Obama administration. That leaves probably less, because at the time we get into elections season, they're lame duck. And they're basically checked out. So it's about a year. So guess who gets to inherit this agreement? Guess who gets to implement it? Guess who gets to deal with both its positive terms and its deep flaws? Well, if you're Hillary Clinton and you think you're going to win the presidency, it's Hillary Clinton. She's going to own this deal. So she is in the most difficult political situation of all. Can she distance herself sufficiently from the president in order to provide some political space so that she doesn't end up owning the deal? But can she distance herself from the president without incurring the wrath of the Obama world that she needs?
Does the administration believe that they can have an agreement like this and not have the Senate ratify?
Oh, they don't, for sure. Because not a treaty, it doesn't have to be ratified. And they don't think they need Congress for sanctions relief, because the president can use his executive orders and national security interest waivers and other executive branch powers to basically suspend sanctions. So, the president has said, New York Times, breaking news, a month ago, we don't need Congress. And he said his State of the Union. I have a pen and I have a phone. And I will rule by fiat. Immigration? Environmental regulation? I mean, whatever your point of view is on those debates, and I'm probably more to the left on those issues than I am on national security issues. But whether you agree with the president on immigration or on environmental regulations, whatever you agree on, the fact of the matter is the president has made it very clear, Congress, you're intransigent, I can't work with you, I have a pen, I have a phone, and I'm going to rule by executive order. So he's got a landmark nuclear deal available to him that will cement his legacy at a time where there are very few other foreign policy wins. You think President Obama is going to let a Republican-controlled Congress stand in his way? I have a pen and I have a phone.
One more question.
So how unified is the P5+1? What are the divisions like with respect to Russia and China, given some of the other difficulties we're having with both countries? How unified a negotiating position has been, and I guess what are the prospects that unity will continue, or will there be further divisions and splintering? It's great questions. So first on the Iran side, look, I don't think the revolution's over. I don't think the Khamenei thinks the revolution's over. I don't think the Revolutionary Guards think the revolution's over. I don't think the clerical establishment thinks the revolution's over. The Iranian people wish the revolution was over. I often use the analogy that the Iranian regime, to me, is like North Korea. And the Iranian people are like South Korea. Right? The regime itself is brutal and repressive and backward-looking and wants a nuclear weapon and hates America and hates the West. And the American and the Iranian people, like the South Koreans, thrive, want an open market, want liberty, want freedom. And wherever they go in the world, they leave Iran, they come to America, they go to Canada, they go anywhere they go, they succeed because they're brilliant, they're industrious, they're hardworking, they're superbly educated. I mean, they're amazing people. Right? But in Iran, they're just under this terrible jackboot of repression. So they want the revolution to be over, but it ain't over. There's a lot of life left in that revolution. And the clerical military dictatorship that is Iran today has a lot of life ahead of it. But it one day will go. All brutal regimes end up in the dustbin of history. The problem is, along the way, they cause immense suffering. Will Iran be further or closer in 3 to 5 years to a bomb? I think regardless of the agreement that's reached, Iran will be closer. And it'll be closer because, as I said before, Iran will do an agreement on elements of the program it has perfected in order to buy time for elements of the program it hasn't perfected. And what does it need to do? It needs to develop warheads and nuclear triggers. Right? It knows how to enrich uranium. It knows how to reprocess plutonium. It needs to develop the warhead, and it needs to develop the long-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying the warhead, including ICBMs. And that will not be part of an agreement. And we will not know where Iran is developing warheads and conducting nuclear trigger tests, because they'll do it in places that are the size of a laboratory in a country the size of France. And we will not be able to go and find that. And we can't even deal with their ballistic missile program because the Iranians took it off the table. So they will be closer. And the administration says to you folks, the program is frozen, which the President of the United States said last week, and John Kerry said the week before. You should say, frozen? It was a great movie in 2014, my kid's favorite movie. And maybe people in the White House have been watching too many versions of Frozen. But this program ain't frozen unless you believe that weaponization, ballistic missiles, advanced centrifuge R&D, and illicit procurement constitute a frozen program. It's only frozen if you believe Rouhani, who says it's frozen because he's suspended and frozen enrichment, which is basically something he knows how to do and how to restart. The question of the P5+1. So this is an increasingly difficult challenge for the administration. The administration has said repeatedly, and I think for some time they were correct, that amazingly enough, the P5+1 was unified on the Iran issue. That they had a fairly consistent position. Now, the French were more hawkish than the Germans and Brits, and the West was more hawkish than the Russians and Chinese. But by and large, there was a unified position. I really worry that it's breaking down. And it's breaking down over some fundamental realities. Right? The first is that one of our P5+ partners is called Russia. We have a few problems with Russia. We're sanctioning the hell out of Putin. Okay? And we may get into a major escalation with Putin over Ukraine or Moldova or some other poor Eastern European sliver of territory that he's got set in his sights. So I don't see the relationship with Putin getting any better. And I already see reports of this on-again, off-again $20 billion oil for goods deal between Russia and Iran, where the Russians and the Iranians are basically setting out a massive money laundering, illicit finance scheme to do an end run around Western sanctions. So that's Russia. Look, China, complicated relationship. And the Chinese, by and large, have not been great partners with respect to sanctions enforcement. They could have done a lot more damage, but they haven't been great partners. And we've sort of turned a blind eye to Chinese sanctions busting because the reality is, that's a hard problem. We got a lot of equities at stake with China, and we're not necessarily going to go and confront Beijing in a major way. So the Chinese are doing deals with Russia, multi-billion-dollar deals, okay, in defiance of Western sanctions, but we're not going to sanction the Chinese. And they're doing deals with the Iranians, and I think it's only a matter of time before they do more deals. Because, I'll end with this. Ali Khamenei, at the end of the day, he doesn't want a booming economy. Okay? He doesn't want tens of thousands of Westerners in his streets, corrupting his woman with their toxic touch, literally and figuratively. Right? He doesn't like Americans, and he doesn't like Europeans. Ali Khamenei has a plan B. He calls it that in Farsi. He says, I have a plan B. It's amazing what these people say if you actually listen and you believe them. That's the key. He says, I have a plan B. You know what my plan B is? I have an escape hatch from economic pressure. I'll do business with the Russians and the Chinese and the Turks and the Indians, because at the end of the day, they'll do business. I'm not worried about their toxic touch. Right? No Iranian's going to be corrupted by Russian, Chinese, Turkish pop culture, right? Maybe some Indian like dance videos from Mumbai might be very corrupting, but that's probably the only risk he has. So he's got a perfect set of partners to do deals with. They're a rapacious group. They're going to cut hard bargains, but at the end of the day, they'll give him just enough to keep his economy afloat, avoid collapse, and avoid a booming economy, which, by the way, a booming economy means integration into the world, and there's nothing Ali Khamenei wants less than integration into the global community. So keep your eyes on the Russians and the Chinese and the Turks over the next few months, see which way they go. And I hope the administration's right. I hope they can keep them together in a unified position. I worry that increasingly that's going to splinter. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks everyone for coming. But before you go, I do want to ask one quick question. So what can we do? You presented a sobering and scary thought. Give us some suggestions. We're here to motivate.
Call your senators. Call your senators. Flood their switchboard with calls, because the other side is flooding the switchboard. I'm serious. If you don't call your senators, they don't hear from you, they're going to hear from the other side, and the other side is so incredibly well mobilized. Okay? Incredibly. I can't even tell you how many organizations are on the other side flooding those switchboards. Call your senators. Call your congressmen. Tell them that you want to see sanctions bills moving in the next Congress. You want to see Congress putting any agreement to a vote. It is absolutely outrageous that the administration can sign an agreement and Congress doesn't get to vote on it. Corker-Graham bill. Corker-Graham bill calls for a vote. Kirk-Menendez calls for further sanctions. Right? Both bills talk about what is the parameters of an acceptable deal, so that you don't have to be a nuclear physicist to figure out, oh, wait a second, that's not a good nuclear deal, because there'll be a nice set of parameters laid out with bipartisan support that says, unless you meet the following 7 or 8 criteria, this is not a good nuclear deal. Mr. President, go back and renegotiate. Kirk-Menendez, Graham Corker, and others to be announced. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.